The night of the Carter family reunion was supposed to be about nostalgia, laughter, and the comforting lie that blood always forgives. But the moment Eleanor Carter stepped into the candlelit ballroom of the old Vermont estate, she felt something shift deep in her chest, as if the walls themselves remembered secrets no one dared to speak aloud, because this was the house where her grandfather died under mysterious circumstances 40 years ago. The house where fortunes were quietly rewritten, names erased, and one child was left with nothing but questions that followed her into adulthood. And before you go any further into this story, pause for 1 second, because if you love intense family drama, slow burn revenge, and shocking truths that explode when you least expect them, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below about whether you believe revenge is ever justified. Because what unfolds tonight will force you to question loyalty, justice, and the price of silence. Eleanor adjusted the simple black dress she wore, deliberately understated among the glittering gowns and tailored suits of relatives who measured their worth in trust funds and property deeds, and as she moved through familiar faces that smiled without warmth, her mind drifted back to the last time she had stood in this house as a child, clutching her mother's hand while lawyers whispered in corners and her grandfather's will was read with surgical precision, stripping her mother of inheritance rights under the excuse of mental instability, a claim that shattered their lives and forced them to leave town under a cloud of humiliation. While Eleanor's uncles and cousins grew rich on land, stocks, and a family name polished to perfection, years passed. Her mother died quietly in a rented apartment in Oregon, and Eleanor learned early that the world rewarded those who planned patiently, who listened more than they spoke, and who never revealed their true intentions until the moment arrived. And tonight, after 15 years of careful preparation, education, and silent observation, she had returned, not as the discarded granddaughter, but as the executor of a truth buried deeper than any grave on the Carter estate. Across the room stood Marcus Carter, her eldest uncle, the self-appointed patriarch, laughing loudly with investors and local politicians, his confidence built on the belief that the past had been safely sealed away. And near him was his daughter Claire, once Eleanor's closest cousin, now a stranger, polished by privilege, whose eyes flickered with confusion when she recognized Eleanor, as if seeing a ghost that should not exist. And Eleanor allowed herself a thin smile, because confusion was only the beginning. The reunion dinner began with speeches about legacy, resilience, and unity, words that tasted bitter to Eleanor as she listened to Marcus praise the family for overcoming hardship without ever acknowledging the woman he had destroyed to get here. And as dessert was served, Eleanor rose from her seat uninvited, the soft clink of her glass silencing the room, her voice calm but carrying a weight that demanded attention, and she introduced herself simply, not as a Carter, but as the granddaughter of Harold Carter, the founder of everything they celebrated tonight. And murmurs rippled through the room as memories stirred uneasily. She spoke of love for family, of the importance of truth, and of how reunions existed, not just to remember the good but to confront what had been hidden. And then she did something no one expected. She connected her phone to the projector meant for childhood photos and vacation memories, and instead displayed a scanned document dated 40 years earlier, a medical report declaring her mother mentally unfit, signed by a doctor whose name Eleanor let hang in the air like a loaded weapon. Gasps filled the room as Eleanor explained, with controlled precision, that this report was forged, that the doctor had been paid, and later fled the country, and that she possessed sworn affidavits, bank records, and a recorded confession obtained shortly before the man's death. And Marcus's smile collapsed into a mask of rage and disbelief as Eleanor continued, revealing that the inheritance clause stripping her mother of rights was triggered by that false diagnosis, making the entire redistribution of assets legally void. Panic crept into the room as lawyers whispered urgently, phones buzzed, and alliances fractured in real time. But Eleanor was not finished, because this was never just about money, it was about accountability. She revealed that the estate land had been illegally rezoned through bribery, that offshore accounts held funds siphoned from family trusts, and that federal investigators had already received every document, every recording, every signature needed to reopen cases long considered closed. And as security moved toward her, Eleanor calmly informed them that the building was surrounded by agents who had waited patiently for this exact moment, the moment when every guilty party would be present, comfortable, and exposed. Chaos erupted. Claire broke down in tears, older relatives shouted denials, and Marcus lunged forward only to be restrained, screaming that Eleanor was destroying the family, and she met his eyes, without flinching, telling him that the family had been destroyed the day he chose greed over truth. As sirens wailed outside and agents entered the room, Eleanor felt no triumph, only a quiet, heavy release, because revenge was never loud or cruel. The way movies promised it was methodical, lonely, and demanded years of restraint that few could survive. And as handcuffs clicked and names were read aloud, Eleanor walked out of the estate into the cold night air, knowing this was only the first door she had opened, because justice, once awakened, did not stop at a single confession or a single arrest. It moved forward relentlessly, and the legacy of the Carter family, built on lies for decades, had finally begun to collapse under the weight of the truth Eleanor carried back home. The investigation that followed the reunion did not explode overnight the way gossip blogs suggested. Instead, it unfolded slowly, methodically, like a long winter settling over the Carter name, and Eleanor watched it all from a distance she had deliberately created because she understood something most people did not: that real revenge required patience even after the truth was revealed. And while headlines spoke of arrests, frozen assets, and reopened civil suits, Eleanor returned to a small rented house near the coast of Maine, a place with no memories attached to pain, where she finally allowed herself to breathe without the weight of anticipation crushing her chest. Federal agents questioned her repeatedly, lawyers requested clarifications, and journalists hunted for interviews, but Eleanor said very little, because silence had always been her sharpest weapon. And as weeks passed, cracks within the family widened into irreversible fractures, with cousins turning on uncles, siblings blaming one another, and decades of forced loyalty unraveling under the pressure of legal scrutiny. Marcus Carter, once untouchable, was denied bail due to flight risk, and photographs of him entering a courthouse in handcuffs circulated everywhere. Yet what haunted Eleanor most was not his downfall. It was the quiet voicemail left by Claire late one night, her voice trembling as she asked why Eleanor had never told her the truth earlier. Why she had been allowed to grow up admiring a father who was now exposed as a manipulator willing to destroy his own sister for wealth. Eleanor listened to the message more than once, not out of guilt, but out of recognition. Because Claire was now standing at the edge of the same abyss Eleanor had stared into years ago. The moment when reality rewrites everything you believed about your family. Eventually, Eleanor agreed to meet her, choosing a neutral cafe far from the estate. And when Claire arrived, she looked smaller somehow, stripped of certainty and privilege, and as they spoke, Eleanor revealed pieces of her past she had never shared before: the eviction notices, the medical bills, the nights her mother cried herself to sleep, convinced the world believed she was unstable. And Claire listened in silence, realizing that the inheritance she enjoyed was soaked in suffering she never questioned. The meeting ended without forgiveness, without dramatic reconciliation, but with an understanding that some wounds were too deep for apologies, and that awareness itself could be a form of punishment. Meanwhile, deeper layers of the investigation emerged, revealing that Harold Carter's death, long ruled a heart attack, involved suspicious circumstances tied to pressure and threats aimed at preventing him from amending his will. And although no charges could be filed due to time and lack of living witnesses, the public narrative shifted, transforming the Carter legacy from one of ambition to one of betrayal, and donors pulled out of charities bearing the family name, universities revoked honorary plaques, and investors distanced themselves from anything remotely connected to the estate. Eleanor followed these developments through legal briefings and news alerts. Yet what consumed her thoughts was a discovery she made quietly, alone, while sorting through her mother's old belongings: a locked metal box hidden behind faded photographs containing letters, written by her grandfather in the final months of his life, letters never sent, in which he expressed fear of his own son's regret for not protecting Eleanor's mother, and instructions for evidence he never had time to safeguard. Reading those letters shattered Eleanor in a way public vindication never could, because they confirmed that the man she barely remembered had tried too late to stop what happened, and that the revenge she executed was not just hers, but a continuation of a truth interrupted by death. Compelled by this knowledge, Eleanor contacted the lead investigator and submitted the letters as supplemental context, not for prosecution, but for historical record, ensuring that future accounts could not paint the crimes as misunderstandings or isolated mistakes. As winter turned to spring, trials approached, plea deals were whispered about, and the family estate was placed under federal receivership, destined to be sold and dismantled. And on the day Eleanor received official confirmation that her mother's name had been legally cleared and restored in all records, she visited the Carter property one last time with court permission, walking through empty halls stripped of luxury, past rooms echoing with ghosts of dinners and arguments long forgotten by everyone except her. In her mother's childhood bedroom, untouched for decades, Eleanor sat on the floor and allowed herself to cry, not from sadness alone, but from exhaustion. Because carrying a revenge, this carefully built, required sacrificing parts of oneself that never fully returned. As she left the house, she placed her grandfather's letters in the hands of a historical archivist, refusing ownership of the estate or its proceeds, choosing instead to fund mental health advocacy programs in her mother's name, transforming the lie that destroyed her life into a truth that might protect others. Yet even as Eleanor tried to move forward, she understood that consequences rippled outward endlessly, and somewhere within prison walls and legal offices, people were still bargaining, blaming, and rewriting stories to soften their guilt. And she prepared herself for one final confrontation she knew was inevitable, because revenge did not truly end when the truth surfaced. It ended only when the past could no longer reach forward and demand more of her soul. The confrontation Eleanor anticipated arrived not with drama but with a letter handwritten, shaky, and stamped with the return address of a federal detention facility. And the moment she saw Marcus Carter's name, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest, not fear but the old reflex of vigilance she had learned as a child when adults decided her future without explanation. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she made tea, stood by the window, watching the gray Atlantic swell and retreat, reminding herself that she no longer owed that man anything, not answers, not forgiveness, not even anger, yet curiosity won in the end, because unfinished stories have a way of demanding attention. Marcus wrote about betrayal, about how Eleanor had misunderstood events, about how power required difficult choices, and how he had done what he believed necessary to preserve the family. And the more she read, the clearer it became that prison had not humbled him, it had only sharpened his ability to rationalize cruelty. But buried near the end of the letter was something different, a confession not of guilt but of fear, fear that Eleanor would succeed in something far more devastating than legal punishment, that she would erase him from the narrative entirely. That realization clarified her final step. Because revenge was never about watching someone suffer behind bars, it was about reclaiming authorship of the story itself. Eleanor contacted a publishing attorney and a documentary producer she had vetted years earlier, someone known for refusing sensationalism in favor of verified truth, and she offered them access to everything: the documents, the recordings, the letters, the legal transcripts, and her own account, not framed as vengeance but as a case study in how power manipulates systems designed to protect families. As production began, resistance surfaced immediately. Former Carter allies threatened lawsuits. Public relations firms attempted to discredit Eleanor quietly, and anonymous messages warned her to stop, but none of it carried the weight it once might have, because exposure stripped threats of their illusion. And Eleanor responded to every challenge with evidence, not emotion. Claire reached out again during this period, this time not as a daughter defending a father, but as a woman, unraveling years of inherited denial, and she offered to testify publicly, to admit what she had benefited from unknowingly. A decision that cost her financial security, but granted her something she had never owned before: integrity. And Eleanor accepted, not as absolution, but as proof that cycles could be interrupted. When the documentary aired, it did not explode with signal-driven frenzy. Instead, it spread slowly, discussed in law schools, ethics panels, and mental health forums, praised for its restraint and criticized by those who preferred villains to be obvious and victims to remain silent. And within that discourse, Eleanor remained composed, refusing to become a symbol or a martyr, insisting she was simply someone who refused to let lies outlive the people they destroyed. Marcus attempted one final maneuver, filing a civil claim alleging emotional distress and reputational damage. And Eleanor faced him across a courtroom for the first time since the reunion, noting how small he seemed without authority to amplify his presence. And when asked to speak, she did not attack him, she did not recount pain theatrically, she stated facts, timelines, and consequences. And the judge dismissed the claim within minutes, noting the overwhelming documentation in Marcus's established pattern of coercion. That dismissal marked the true end of his influence, because courts had now rejected not only his actions, but his narrative. Months later, the Carter estate sold quietly, the land divided, the mansion demolished due to structural decay, and Eleanor watched from a distance as footage showed the walls falling, not with satisfaction, but with acceptance. Because places, like people, could not survive on rot alone. She moved forward deliberately, continuing her advocacy work, mentoring others, navigating family-based financial abuse, and building a life defined not by what was taken from her, but by what she chose to protect. One evening, as she walked along the shoreline at dusk, Eleanor reflected on the question people asked most often, whether revenge had brought her peace. And she realized the word itself was misleading, because what she sought was not retaliation, but correction, a rebalancing of truth that allowed her mother's life to be understood without distortion. And in that understanding, Eleanor finally felt free, not because the past was erased, but because it no longer controlled the future. And the legacy once forged in secrecy had been replaced by something quieter, stronger, and impossible to steal. Time moved differently after the documentary, stretching into long, quiet days where Eleanor discovered that the absence of conflict could feel unsettling after years of strategic vigilance, and she had to relearn how to exist without constantly anticipating resistance. Yet the world did not allow her full retreat, because the truth she released had awakened others who recognized their own stories reflected back at them. And letters began arriving from strangers across the country, sons and daughters disinherited through manipulation, siblings erased by legal language they never understood, spouses trapped by financial control disguised as protection. And Eleanor read every message carefully, not as validation, but as responsibility, understanding that revenge which ended in silence wasted its potential, while revenge that evolved into reform could reshape systems. She accepted invitations to speak at closed-door policy discussions, offering testimony not as an expert, but as evidence, and lawmakers listened when she explained how easily medical authority could be weaponized, how courts favored confidence over truth, and how families exploited emotional bonds to justify exploitation. And although change moved slowly, Eleanor recognized familiar patterns in institutional hesitation. Patterns she had learned to dismantle by persistence rather than outrage. During this time, she received unexpected contact from a man named Thomas Hale, a former accountant employed by the Carter family decades earlier, now elderly and burdened by remorse, who revealed that he had been instructed to alter financial statements connected to the inheritance redistribution. And although the statute of limitations shielded him from prosecution, he offered sworn testimony and original ledgers he had hidden for years, documents that confirmed Eleanor's claims beyond dispute and exposed additional beneficiaries who had escaped scrutiny by remaining quiet. Eleanor hesitated before accepting, not because the information lacked value, but because reopening wounds carried consequences for people who had already lost everything. Yet she concluded that truth delayed remained truth denied, and she submitted the materials to archival authorities, ensuring they would exist beyond her lifetime. As these disclosures circulated in academic and legal circles, a subtle shift occurred. The Carter case became precedent, cited in court arguments and ethics reviews, its lessons extracted and applied. And Eleanor felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that her mother's suffering had not ended in isolation, but had become a turning point for others. Claire, now living modestly and working in a nonprofit unrelated to family wealth, met Eleanor occasionally, their relationship defined not by affection but by mutual respect. And in one conversation, Claire admitted she no longer remembered what it felt like to be certain about the world. A confession Eleanor understood deeply, because certainty had been the first casualty of betrayal. The two women walked separate paths, bound only by a shared history neither attempted to rewrite, and that honesty felt like progress. Meanwhile, Marcus's health declined in custody, reports mentioning stress-related complications and cognitive deterioration. And although Eleanor received updates through legal channels, she refused all requests to visit, understanding that closure did not require proximity, and that some boundaries existed not out of cruelty but self-preservation. She focused instead on completing a final project, a comprehensive digital archive compiling evidence, correspondence, expert commentary, and personal narrative into a permanent, publicly accessible record, designed not to accuse but to inform. And when it launched quietly, without media fanfare, Eleanor felt the last thread of obligation loosen. Because the story no longer depended on her presence to survive. On the anniversary of her mother's legal exoneration, Eleanor returned to Oregon, standing outside the apartment building where her mother spent her final years. And she imagined a parallel life, where lies had not intervened, where laughter replaced anxiety, where dignity remained intact. And although grief resurfaced briefly, it no longer overwhelmed her, because grief acknowledged was less dangerous than grief denied. As Eleanor walked away, she understood that revenge had completed its evolution, transforming from personal reckoning into collective awareness, and the legacy, once dominated by secrecy, now existed as a cautionary tale, studied, remembered, and impossible to repeat in the same way, because the greatest revenge was not destruction, but illumination, and once the truth was fully seen, it could never again be hidden in the shadows of wealth or tradition. The final chapter of Eleanor's journey did not arrive with a phone call or a headline. It arrived quietly on a fog-drenched morning when she received official notice that Marcus Carter had died in custody from complications related to long-term stress and untreated illness, and as she read the report, she searched herself for triumph, relief, or even anger, but found only a solemn stillness because death had closed his story without granting him understanding, and that felt like consequence enough. The news triggered a predictable wave of commentary, some calling it tragic, others calling it deserved, and Eleanor disengaged from all of it, because public opinion no longer held power over her sense of justice, and instead she focused on what remained unfinished. Not in terms of revenge, but in terms of meaning. She attended no memorials, issued no statements, and declined all interview requests, choosing instead to finalize the trust she had established in her mother's name, one dedicated to legal advocacy for individuals falsely declared mentally unfit for financial gain. A quiet mechanism designed to intervene early, before lies could calcify into permanent loss. As the trust began its work, Eleanor reviewed case files late into the night, recognizing familiar patterns of manipulation dressed as concern, and each successful intervention felt like a small correction to a system that once failed her family so completely. Months later, she received a letter from a law school informing her that the Carter case was now required study material in a course on ethical abuse of power, and Eleanor smiled at the irony, because the family name, once synonymous with prestige, was now inseparable from caution, its reputation permanently redefined not by wealth, but by warning. On a personal level, Eleanor finally allowed herself something she had postponed for years, a future not designed around opposition, and she moved west, closer to the ocean, purchasing a modest home with windows that faced the horizon rather than the past. And there she built routines unmarked by strategy, mornings defined by walks, evenings by reading, and friendships unburdened by secrecy. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, she found a photograph of herself as a child, standing beside her mother and grandfather on the Carter estate lawn. All three, unaware of the fracture already forming beneath their feet, and instead of sorrow, Eleanor felt gratitude, because memory preserved truth, even when institutions tried to erase it. She framed the photo and placed it in her living room, not as tribute to loss, but as acknowledgement of endurance. Claire sent a final message around this time, brief and unembellished, thanking Eleanor for refusing to soften the truth, admitting that honesty had cost her comfort but restored her sense of self, and Eleanor replied with equal restraint, wishing her clarity rather than peace, because clarity endured longer. As years passed, the Carter story faded from public fascination, replaced by newer scandals, newer villains, and Eleanor welcomed the obscurity, understanding that anonymity was not erasure, but freedom, and she continued her work without seeking recognition, satisfied knowing that the systems which once protected abusers now carried safeguards forged by exposure. Occasionally, she was asked whether she would do it all again, whether the years of planning, restraint, and sacrifice were worth the cost, and Eleanor answered honestly that revenge alone would never have been enough. But justice, shaped by patience, had given her something far greater than retribution. It had given her authorship over her own narrative. On the 10th anniversary of the family reunion, Eleanor returned briefly to Vermont, standing on the land where the estate once stood, now an open field reclaimed by nature, and as wind moved through tall grass where walls once loomed, she felt the final echo of the past dissolve, because nothing built on deception survived indefinitely, and nothing rooted in truth required defense. She left without ceremony, without looking back, carrying no trophies, no scars she could not bear, and no unfinished business, only the quiet certainty that legacy was not inherited through blood or property, but earned through choices, made when no one was watching. And if this story made you think, unsettled you, or reminded you that silence can be as powerful as confrontation, take a moment now to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below with your thoughts on whether truth should always come at any cost. Because some stories do not end when revenge is complete, they end when awareness begins.